Hello and welcome to the Paul Weller Fan Podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and on this episode, we delve into the Style Council's ambitious and often misunderstood short film, JerUSALem. Delighted to welcome Lucy Hooberman to the podcast, documentary filmmaker, journalist, and researcher who produced both JerUSALem and the Red Wedge documentary, Days Like These. Now, I should say that we chatted a while ago. This was last year, at the point at which I was embarking on my huge big project, Paul Weller, Dancing Through the Fire, the authorized oral history. And Lucy has loads of experience in that space, oral history, so I asked her lots of questions on that as well. So I hope you find this interesting. Her insights into the creation and reception of JerUSALem really do offer a unique perspective on what is a bold and surreal piece of pop cinema. Let's get into it. Lucy Hooberman, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure. I think I'm a late addition.
Well, there's always room for more. And the great thing is Paul's continuing to make new music. So who knows? This will continue forever, right? To kick this off, let's understand when it was that you first discovered the music of Paul Weller. I'm assuming it would have been the Jam.
It would have been the Jam, but I think I became a fan more with the Style Council. But I would have said, yes, I would have come across the Jam, of course.
Okay, so the connection really is the Style Council then.
The connection is Red Wedge.
That was based on you as a filmmaker, presumably, but also as somebody who was interested in that world of politics and delivering change, I assume.
Well, I was an aspiring filmmaker, I would say, at the beginning of Red Wedge. I was working at the Institute of Contemporary Arts and I had been approached to be a local councillor in Westminster where I lived, and that really wasn't for me. And I'd always been interested in culture, let's say creative industries, culture as a means of change more than mainstream politics, although I came from quite a political family. I actually read an article about this thing called Red Wedge being launched in one of the Sunday papers, and it said Labour Party, music, young people. And I'm like, And I phoned up the Labour Party. I mean, didn't give any phone numbers or anything. And there was Billy. And I phoned up and I said, what's this? And they tried to put me through to 1 million people. And eventually someone told me where there was going to be a meeting and I pitched up. So I didn't know anyone. I wasn't like there because I knew Billy or Paul or Anna Joy or anyone. I pitched up, walked in, and I had made something, but I can't remember what. I'd have to look at my diary. Yeah, I think I've been working in Birmingham actually with a film and video cooperative, making a drama for the BFI and Channel 4. About young people and unemployment and change. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Anyway, I pitched up. I met them all. I met Anna Joy and Billy. They were talking about the tour, but it was quite a while before the tour. And I said, is anyone planning to make a film? But I mean, it was like in the dark ages. And, there was not all these independent funds for filmmaking. And I wrote a piece actually for New Socialist about young people and how all youth funding was being closed down. And so we decided that we would try and work with local filmmakers along the route of the tour to stimulate young filmmakers and local employment, as it were, rather than just show up with this posse, because undoubtedly there would have been many big volunteers from London. And my ideology, I suppose, was inspired by the miners' strike, because during the miners' strike, there were a lot of videos made by local people, by women and by collectives. And you had to be a certain age to know that. And I thought, right, I want to work with local groups. We're going along the way. We're going to youth engagement events all along the way. That's part of our platform. Let's do it like that. And I then found out that in order to do that, in order to be allowed to work with these collectives, I'd already worked with one in Birmingham for the film. In order to be allowed to work with them, I had to go to my union, which was the ACTT before it was Bec 2. And I had a meeting with a character called Roy Lockett, who was very important and scary and bearded. And
of course he was.
I had to negotiate for the right to be able to work with local people, which I thought was just a good idea, and have a spine of a crew coming on the bus for the tour. So there was some continuity and then dipping into coverage from local teams. I had no idea there was a ACTT agreement with, I don't know, because these collectives were funded by the BFI, the Arts Council and regional something or others that don't exist anymore. And so they were called enfranchised workshops. In order to allow them to be on television and to work with people who weren't in the workshops, there was major negotiation. Anyway, I did it. And he said I was very impressive. And then there was no money. And then I went to meet an incredible character whose name I can't remember. I want to say his call was called Dick Muscat or Muscat. I need to look him up. At the DLC that was in the process of being closed. And he had been in the SAS, I was told. So second amazing, larger than life character. And I don't know if you recall, but towards the end of the DLC, they were not exactly throwing money out of the window, but they had to get rid of a lot of money. So he gave us 20K and that was it. 20K, not much, but 20K. We got the Skeletal London team, which was me, a really good director called Don Coots, and a young filmmaker called Charles McDougall, who's now deeply famous and I think in Hollywood. And other people helped along the way with editing, Marta, various other people. But that's to start with, we had to have something to start with. And then we got these workshops, I think in Cardiff, I'd have to look back, in Birmingham, in Edinburgh and in Newcastle to film local content. So it was never going to be like a 6-camera, 10-camera gig shoot. It was quite lo-fi video, but I mean, it's what we wanted. All of that took some time to sort out. And then Channel 4 picked it up for a youth season. So we got the money for the post-production. I mean, it was, in those days, you might think 20K is a lot of money, but it wasn't very much money. And various other people came on board, production companies, to help with the post-production. So I met Paul at some of the Red Wedge meetings. And then I was on the bus for the tour, and in the dressing rooms, I don't know if you've ever seen Days Like These. It's a charming film, and it's got little things in it that are quite priceless now. And you'll see Paul in that film was young and awkward in interview terms. I mean, not on stage, obviously, but, all that interviewing and stuff was like, no, not really their thing. And that's how I met him. And I can't say we had masses of conversations, because it was so busy. But at some point after that film went out, and I think it was the following year, when he was in a position where, you might know more about this than me actually, where Polydor was offering him I think we'd now call it not a career break, but a kind of a structured pause to do a project, whatever he wanted project, because of other things that were going on. And the thing he wanted to do was make a film that he and Paolo had written. I think he must have got all that sorted out with Polydor, and they said, fine. I've never talked about it since, but I think he must have thought, who do I know who I can trust? Because I think it was very much a question with him then, and probably is still now. Good question, which is, who can I work with, who I trust? I mean, maybe less so now. He's so much more sure of himself.
Well, no, he's definitely an easier interviewee these days. You get that sense, right?
Well, he looks happier. I saw him at that, what was the name of the venue for the videos for the latest album recently? Oh,
Earth, the 66.
Yeah, at Earth. He looked pretty laid back.
Now, so in terms of Red Wedge, and it's interesting because I think often if you're running that project, you're not in the moment of the gig in the same way as fans would be. But what are your memories of those live concerts? Because the lineups were unbelievable, really, weren't they? Fabulous
lineups. Well, at the beginning, I used to try and stand on the side of the stage, and then I realized that was because I wasn't filming myself. The core team was filming, and we didn't film all the main gigs. So I think I remember quite a lot of them. But I used to then go to the back and try and feel it from the audience point of view. I thought they were exhilarating. They were all exhilarating. But for me, as a more, let's say, cultural worker type of person, they were exhilarating for the music, of course, but also for the point of the project. And that was a bit hard to tell, going along. But, if you talk to Daniel later on, he's written all the books, Daniel Rachel, he was a kid who went to the gig in Birmingham from a conservative family whose life changed. I think if I'd done some more vox pops out front, I would have got the kind of impression I was looking for. But certainly as a gig, they were amazing, absolutely amazing. But I do remember one event that sadly we didn't film and nobody seems to remember except me, but I'm sure it happened, which was in Newcastle when we went to the Young People's event, which was in a community centre. And the audience were getting very riled up because Paul wasn't there and the big names weren't there. Billy was there and they were getting very impatient. And he took the stage and had to answer their questions. And Paul and other people had gone to the Tube, which was in Newcastle, the TV program, because they were being interviewed. And so a lot of the people who'd come for the big names were disappointed, and Billy handled it very, very well. But Elvis Costello had turned up and he did a set for us. And that was even more magical because he sang not more magical, but he sang Shipbuilding in Newcastle,
Wow.
And I hadn't really been prepared for that. I found that very, very moving and political, totally political in a different way. It wasn't like vote, vote, sign up to vote, but very, very, very poignant. So I think that, the reasons I went in, I felt were sort of being borne out by some of the effects. But I think disappointment that Paul may talk about, subsequently, even now, about why did we do it? Was it worth it? It was more about something that I already knew, which was about how much any political party would actually do as a result of a pile of however famous young people coming in. And I'd already decided, because I'd been approached by Westminster Council and various people, that it wasn't for me, because the closer I got to any sort of centre of a political party, the further I felt I was removed from my own strengths and also from the possibility of doing what we set out to achieve. And I don't really want to call that cynicism. I think it's kind of realpolitik. And when you first come into contact with it, if you do come into contact with it, it's pretty upsetting if you're idealistic. So I felt it was definitely worth doing. I felt Neil Kinnock and various people were very sincere. But the sort of Anna Joy agenda and the youth policy agenda, which I thought was critical, I can't really remember that very much changed in terms of funding for venues and opportunities for young people. And the registering to vote, I couldn't tell you any of us looked at the metrics of whether we moved the needle, as people would say now. But certainly, it was worth doing. And, there was a lot of derision from people who weren't into it, but I thought it was effective in the limited way the media world was limited in those days. I mean, the program, I would say not so much probably because it went out like at 11 o'clock at night on a young people series, but people, dip in and out of it and it's quite fun. And even during the pandemic, when I felt so many young people in the creative industries and musicians, they had no jobs, no funding. They were being told by Rishi Sunak to go and retrain as cyber technicians. I found it hard to understand why there was no protest. And I did put a few posts up there and they all said, well, it's not the 80s, Lucy, we're broke and, there's no work. And so it was a moment, I think, when it was possible to try and do a lot of stuff and just get up and do it. That was also very exciting. I mean, I was in my 20s. I wasn't in my teens. I was in my 20s, but it was very exciting.
I guess there's all that footage as well that hasn't been used. How much, loads and loads of stuff, but where is all this stuff?
Well, that's a good question, which I've been asked many times. So I've got a VHS of, a longer edit, shoddy quality. The people who did the post-production have got names. The production companies no longer exist. And I think it would be a question of seeing whether anybody kept it, because Channel 4 says they don't have it. I mean, I had to look into it a few times. The BFI don't have rushes. People should keep rushes, but people don't keep rushes. So I have got a VHS that somebody, maybe Daniel, came to see, literally got an old VHS player out of a cupboard, tried to hook it up to my TV. And I've still got the VHS. God knows if it will still play. I never digitized it because it was such shoddy quality. And, I think it's hours and hours of, I don't think there's more interview. There's not that much more interview material because I don't think we shot much. So I don't know. I think people imagine there might be lots of exciting stuff that we didn't use, but I'm sure Don and Martin and Charles used the best bits.
Let's talk about that break project that you mentioned then. And I know actually Mick mentioned to me about the fact that they got some money as well from Japan from like a TV ad for TDK cassettes, I think.
That's right. I think what I remember is they'd done an ad. I don't know if that's what Paul was referring to at Earth when he said, people used to pay £250,000 for a video, because I think I'm so sensitive about JerUSAlem because it was so panned originally by most people that I think the budget was about 240,000, but it included 4 videos in it. If you actually look at the structure of it, there were very few instructions from Polydor, but one of the instructions was 4 possibly releasable videos. So you'll see, if you look at it, apart from the, the scripted narrative, there are 4 very, very different potential video releases. And I think 2 were released. So I think that's quite good value. I mean, you can do things for a lot less now. This was the whole point, I think, of that event. In those days, people were throwing silly money at videos. That reminded me that the groundbreaking changes in film and video weren't just in the 80s with the advent of video for distribution. It was much later with the advent of smaller cameras so that you could shoot things yourselves, and then the phone. So, every decade there was an innovation that made film or video output cheaper every decade. And the reason I was thinking about it was thinking about the budget for JerUSALem, which seems like a lot in retrospect. It was actually defined by the record company because they needed to have a film for cinema, a video for distribution by Palace or whichever, Virgin, I think it was. I can't even remember who distributed it. And, video for broadcast. So all of these formats were encapsulated by the use of Super 16, a now probably long forgotten film format.
I guess now it's a bit of where we talk about films being fully created in IMAX and then some films being fully created in the iPhone. Back then, obviously, those weren't any considerations at all. But the fact that it's got a cinema release is kind of remarkable, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure I could actually find you a detail of which cinemas it was in. But what I do remember between Richard Belfield, the director, and Paul and Paolo and me, because I had to answer to Polydor, I suppose, was should we shoot on video or should we shoot on film? And this was something that was being discussed already long before MTV because video was cheaper and sort of easier to get around. I had already been approached by the British Film Institute to be something called a video production officer in the film department. And I wasn't really sure I wanted to be a manager. I wanted to be a maker. So I was making a feature film on video as an experiment for the British Film Institute Channel 4. But push comes to shove, most directors in the mid-80s want to be shooting on film. And most artists want to be making a film on film because it's, the proper, cool, artistic medium. I mean, when I think back to lugging that crane and the whole film crew and all that heavy equipment down the cliffs of Dorset to that ledge for some scene where Paul was wearing full monocle, sort of kingly regalia and green wellies. You can see, if you see any of the production shots, how many people made that trek. And nowadays, someone will go down with their phone and have a good old time for 2 and 6.
Well, imagine the health and safety forms you'd have to fill in now for that. Goodness me.
I think we had to do them then. But it was a high old time for this debate between film and video. And video was the newcomer that was considered to be inferior, still considered to be rather inferior. But really, with the rise of digital cameras, smaller cameras and iPhones and edits. What you can do now is make lovely films, aka videos, for a fraction of the cost with a lot of effects, which you would have had to book into a very, very expensive and enjoyable suite in Soho to achieve back in the day. So I think that is where the money came from. I was hired and then I had to find the director and everybody.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And the locations. And the script was non-negotiable. So I don't take any flack for the script. Thank you very much. And I don't really think anybody should take any flack for the script because it was unbelievably funny at the time. It was a bit complex for, and it was a bit against the grain of what people were expecting from the Style Council at the time. But I don't know if I sent you some background articles. I don't know if you saw them, but I sent you a page that was nothing to do with our film because it reminded me of the time when there was a lot of critique in the NME about the government and about legislation. We were all in opposition. We doing all of this stuff were not followers of Maggie Thatcher. So to be in opposition and to make something oppositional was fairly standard, to be honest. I think they did it in quite a clever way. I mean, in a normal producer's job, you would be sitting down with the writer and director and saying, actually, this part really could be rewritten, or do you think this is really necessary? Is anyone going to get this? We were told it was like non-negotiable script.
I guess also as a producer, you'd also be involved with the director in terms of casting. But actually, you've got your 4 actors. I don't know where you rate them on the scale in terms of Paul, Mick, Dee and Steve.
Yeah.
and others, obviously. But,
I think the kind of film it was, which was a kind of cross between Voltaire, Candide and a road movie. You didn't really need fully rounded characters. But there were some nice cameos, which we definitely got in there. Quite a lot, of famous people in there. I don't know how many you've clocked who've become quite famous.
Well, even more famous now, I think you're right.
Yeah. Much more famous now. Oh, no, much more famous now. So the director, Richard Belfield, is someone I worked with before. He was a documentary filmmaker and had been a news person. And they wanted this originally. They wanted this kind of verite feel, which they got at the beginning with, I think there were black and white sequences of the Style Council running away and all of that. Their sort of idea that a lot of this was social commentary. I think he did it very well because as director, you're really handling the talent. And I did feel a bloke would be better in those days for them. And I think he did well. I don't know what you think of the acting. I don't think we're here to discuss their acting, really.
Well, Paul has just got an acting part. I don't know if you know this. So
I have.
But I don't know if that was the show reel that he used. So, look, here you go.
Somehow doubt it.
Well, the thing is, though, as a Style Council fan, and I at the time, my discovery of Paul was a solo artist. So I have to say this is, my digging into JerUSAlem was VHS and discovery of the back catalogue. Yeah. But if you're a Style Council fan at the time, like you say, you're getting 4 brilliant promo videos for some really strong tracks as well, actually, off that album.
Yeah.
And you're getting to see what is a really fun, quite silly in parts, but making some quite serious points in a lot of places as well. Video, I don't know what people were thinking it would be more than that, really. What more do you want? Like, here's your favourite band. You're getting to see that.
Okay, from our point of view, as a team, we delivered on budget and on time. And Polydor, it seems, had never come across any producer who delivered on budget and on time. And I was offered a job by them afterwards, which I turned down. But I had a few meetings with them, which was like, oh my God, you can get them to do things. Ooh, yeah. Try giving them things they want to do. So from our point of view, it worked well, given the brief. Okay. I remember, I think probably the film I told you about in Birmingham, actually, I must have made after this film because I used to travel up and down to Birmingham on the train and I saw the studio video, It Didn't Matter film video on those, I don't know, on platforms, they used to have these little screens and they used to play videos. I saw my film.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. As a passenger. And I thought, God, that's amazing. It was only later as I began to understand that I think Paul and maybe I don't know who had played it as, in effect, an opening act for some of his appearances where, correct me if I'm wrong, it may have been booed or people didn't like it. I may have made that up. That the word sort of was that it wasn't either a good film or successful. And I'm not clear, even to this day, I feel the kind of things Paul might say now is that, wasn't really worth doing. And I know that Paul and Paolo fell out. I don't know why to this day they fell out. You might know. So it sort of got caught up as let's call it a product or, whatever, a project in a lot of other stuff. The Style Council was moving on. We don't like that. Every time Paul changed into a new phase of his life, the fans didn't like it. So once I began to understand that by looking, back a bit and forwards, I realized that, unintelligible, really, I suppose, if you didn't know what a serious thinker he was. And so not apologetic about it. The script was a bit quixotic and daft, but, a big band able to laugh at themselves, personally, I find attractive.
And so much of music and pop and rock at that point was Duran Duran weren't making JerUSAlem, right? There was a lot of very seriousness and it's not, this is not a serious thing, right? This is fun.
Was exactly one of the themes of the whole film, which is on the, pompous though they might feel in retrospect it was running away from the demands of the music industry to conform to being this, that, or the other. That's exactly how it opens. What are they being put on trial for? So, okay, maybe it's a big statement made in a form that wasn't understood, but I think it was enjoyable.
Well, I think in those interviews as well, we talked about those press interviews with Paul around that time on this project and others. He was talking about almost kind of like, just wasn't sure where the Style Council fitted into this industry. They were doing things like Saturday Superstore and phone-ins, and it's just like, it just felt so uncomfortable. But they're like, we don't really know our places. But it's brave to be pushing the kind of envelope to go, actually, we're not going to have a support act. We're going to show this film. Because if I went to a gig now and the first 20 minutes, 30 minutes is a film, it's a big bit like, this is a bit random. But he's just trying different things, right? So that's what you've got to do.
Yeah.
But Stephen Mick said to me, and we talked about this in Brighton at the exhibition, just talked to me how much fun the shoot was. So
did they?
To forget the end product, all right, and you can debate that till the cows come home and all that, right? But actually, what they talked about was just how brilliant what was it, 4 nights, something like that, and just how much fun it was, the hotels and the camaraderie in the shoot, and everybody just had an amazing time. And ultimately, that's what life's about, right?
Well, that really cheers me up because of the kind of things that were said. I barely ever see them, and I've certainly never discussed it with them. I found it a bit hard to know how they think about it in retrospect. But I can tell you that we didn't stay in fancy hotels. They were local hotels. It was pretty early days for Paul and Dee. They were together, and I've got some lovely photographs of them walking across the fields together. They adopted a kitten, I think, or 2, even from one of the little places they stayed in. It was Mick's birthday on the shoot. Somebody made him a birthday cake. We served it up to him in the windmill. And so it did feel quite ordinary. I can't say that ordinary, because if anybody on the crew was starstruck, there was no hint of any silly behavior. And they had their minders as well along. I think Kenny came along and some other people. I think John came down. I can't remember. There were all sorts of people who said they came down for a day that I don't remember. I think there was some photographers who came at the end to do some shots that have ended up on album covers. So, I mean, I had a lot going on, so I didn't meet every single person, but it was a very good setup. On a lot of shoots, stuff happens. People have arguments, people walk out, you have to find a replacement. There was honestly nothing. And I think perhaps that was the strength of the locations. We had unbelievably good luck with the weather. All of those countryside areas I knew very well from my childhood. So they weren't hard to find. The only place I had to use a location scout for were the cliffs and the sea where Paul was on the chair and the wellies and the waves and all of that. Crazy scene. And that was quite interesting because we had to get all the kit down some very treacherous cliff paths. But everywhere else I sort of knew.
Okay.
And obviously I did a recce with the director, but I already knew what I was showing him. So I think it felt quite, I don't want to say homely, it sounds dreadful, but it was friendly. It wasn't big. There weren't a lot of liggers. There was nobody, I don't think anybody discovered us. I don't think any fan, I can't remember, there was no social media. I don't think anyone knew what anyone was doing. I mean, can you imagine that kind of privacy now?
I think often when people, at that time, when people were making music videos, music promo videos, nobody was thinking, in 40 years' time, these things are still going to be discussed and talked about. And most videos weren't and aren't, right? So most promo videos disappeared without trace. They were on top of pops for a couple of weeks or whatever, and then gone. Whereas actually here we are, what is it, nearly 40 years later, and we're still talking about that. That's success in my mind, right?
Thank you so much. I mean, you're still talking about it, which is good. So
yeah, but that's most of it's not. Most of it was done and gone, and people.
No, I know. Unless you get a slot on the Super Bowl or whatever, the Brits, you're kind of You're right. That is absolutely the context in which, in a way, they were being churned out. So we did have a bit more time. I don't remember the shoot being 2 weeks, but it might have been, 12 days, 2 weeks.
Well, in the article that you share with me as well, they were talking about the fact, I think it was Simon Halfon and Paolo and Paul were talking about the fact that actually they'd like more budget to turn it into a full motion picture, right?
Well, that does go to show they were into it at the time. It's hard for me to untangle because, I've heard people, I think they're onto something. I mean, if I read the articles again, which I didn't have time to do, and other articles, I think Paul had wanted to make Absolute Beginners, or he'd wanted to make a different film. So I think the concept of doing a film was very important to him. And I think the friendship with Paolo and the NME was the vehicle. But, he wasn't a person in those days who was sitting around going, I've been given an opportunity to do anything I want. Who do I want to write with? Who shall I cast? No, I think he was talking to his then mate, and this is what they came up with. And so it was very much of the moment. And now, I suppose, in another world, if you've reached the peak of your career and someone says, what film would you like to do? You might cast around a bit more widely. But I think it was very much of its time. And I think they were all being very genuine. And that's why I hated the criticism, because I felt, okay, they're bound to get the sort of criticism for being silly. But I mean, that was the point. Be silly and say something.
But also, I think at that point, they were getting caned for everything. The music, the live gigs, the Cost of Loving album, the Confessions album that came next. And actually, you listen to that album, particularly Confessions, a great album, And so I don't think they could do anything at that point. It's just, the press decided that there was an agenda.
The moment.
Yeah, exactly. Paul was done. And even when the Style Council get rejected and he's all washed up, according to the industry, he can't even get a record deal. And then, look at us now, the 30 years of a solo career. It's mad. What were your connections with Paul after that project? Did you keep in touch for a bit, or was it kind of actually you're on to the next job?
Well, I went off to Birmingham to make this drama that I told you was before. I think it was after. Now I remember seeing the video on the platform. So that was a story about kids being unemployed, which in the late 80s was fairly common. And one of them gets a job joining the police, and that really sets all his friends on fire. But we worked with 2 local rappers called the Wee Papa Girl Rappers. And I stayed a bit with music for a while. I also filmed with Artists Against Apartheid on Clapham Common. It's all a bit of a blur which order it was all on. And my life then went in a different direction, because after working with JerUSALem as an Artist Against Apartheid, doing that, I started to make several documentaries in South Africa about apartheid, pretending to be a tourist. And I sort of really went off on a different track. So I didn't get in touch for a few years. And then I've sort of popped up here or there. I've kept in touch with Nikki and went to the exhibition, and I occasionally go to gigs, but I don't go backstage. I don't ask to meet up, but I probably will. And I'm going to Dee's concert at Coco because I'm very sort of fond of them. And I've chat to Steve a bit on Facebook. And also I was friends with Helen Turner, who was in the band, albeit not in the band, and Steve Sidelnik, but not very close to. I think with Paul, he was so surrounded all the time and so under pressure. Even looking through my photos, I never really stuck my lens anywhere near him. And he wanted to, and there was private time with Dee. But I remain very fond of them all. I'm actually thinking now, so many years later, looking at his career, I think what is so admirable as an artist, because you wouldn't have said in the 80s, oh, I'm an artist, you'd be like, I've got a band, Yeah. But as an artist, watching his, in a way, you could call them gear shifts and his changes in his musical career, it's absolutely amazing what he's done, and very creative. And all of that to be in one person, I think I'd probably have more conversation with him now than I used to be able to have, because, we were just all young and doing stuff.
Let me ask you a question about this project that I'm working on. So turning these podcasts and these conversations into a huge, big oral history of over 50 years, the moment that Paul picks up a guitar, pretty much, right, in the early 70s. You've worked on so many oral history projects. I know there's a big project and a lot of work with the BBC and stuff. What advice would you give me? I'm going to pick your brains on this, please, Lucy, because you've got so much experience. This is my first one of these, turning this into a book by the end of this year. What do you need to know? What do I need to know to make this a success?
Okay, you need to know what your publishers want.
Oh, gosh. I should ask them. I really should.
Okay. There's always, if you've got a book or something at the end, there's always a bit of that, isn't there? I think with oral history, and I'm getting a taste of my own medicine today, if you're interviewing people about 30 years ago, brilliant though their memory may be, time does make changes to both memories and facts. I mean, what they think are facts. So depending on what style of book you're ending up in, is there going to be writing between the interviews, or is it going to be verbatim? And if it is, you're going to need to look through anyway for, all the usual slanders and stuff like that. Are you going to be a person during your interview process that says, well, actually, Paul, you say this happened in 1987, but I know it happened in 1985. Would you care to rephrase that? Are you going to be a Jeremy Paxman? Or are you going to be, the classic oral history interviewer that lets people ramble on? And that can lead, I'm not saying it does always, to people wanting to go down in history for certain things described in certain ways. I mean, this may or may not have happened during my BBC oral history project, but that was a big corporate project. That's different from this project. So each project will have its own characteristics. So I've only really done one big official oral history project, and those interviews are now in an archive that other researchers can search, which is good. They weren't made into a book by me, even though I had a window of 3 years to do that. I felt myself to be too close to the material. And also I was an academic then, and I didn't want to write an academic book. So if I went back to write the book now, I would use interviews and intersperse them with other interviews and do other research.
You've landed on one of the, like something that's been going through my brain this week. So I've done 2 interviews this week about the very early days of Paul Weller solo, and both had different recollections on the point of which that single came out, the first album, how that works and whatever. And you're right. It's like, I don't know the truth necessarily. I mean, I could go and probably find out from various producers and stuff, but it's like, but you're right. It's like, actually, I quite like the fact that here we've got one story told from multiple angles and it's all slightly different. And, who do you trust the most?
Yeah, no, as long as no one gets hurt in the process, that is a memory issue, and it is part of this work.
I mean, as I'm getting into it, you realize the scale of the thing, right? It's so, and also, like you say, about being so close to things. It's, I've created the podcast out of a love for Paul Weller and stuff. And to me, every single nuance and every single guest story is fascinating. My publisher may not agree.
So it's an oral history of his life as a musician. There's chronology and there's themes. So it does depend. I mean, I, as a former documentary filmmaker, feel that there's what you record as you go along, and then there's the edit. So you've got a spine, you're shooting or recording to a timetable. And then as people say different things, you think actually something's come out much more than you thought, and something's disappeared much more than you thought. And you can make some editorial sense of that. So you could say as the author, I've interviewed 100 people, but I'm only going to focus on 10. And then it's the reason I've done this. And it's, that's one book. Or you could say one of the most interesting things I'm making all this up. One of the most interesting things to me about Paul is that he rises from the ashes, or he has these gear changes, or he's able to grow musically. And why can Paul do that where so many other bands fail? What makes him the artist that carries on growing or whatever? And then you can do it like that. Chronology is one thing, but it doesn't always tell the best story. It's like this is my last contribution for this subject, it's the difference between biography and memoir. So biography is, they were born in 1959 in blah, And memoir is a lens through which usually the person themselves is writing their life. And that might be my lens through 3 quilts, or my lens through a collection of Japanese rabbits, or my lens through 10 albums, whatever. So I'm not sure you'd be able to do that yet. Or maybe you can. Let me turn this question on you.
No, well, I think I've realised it now. What this is a book about John Weller's card school on the tour. That's what this is.
Yeah.
Him and Kenny Wheeler. Forget Weller. Forget Paul.
So you've got your merch. You've got your merch, the cards. Yeah.
Exactly.
I've got a photo I took of them sitting outside the van with their table, playing cards, I think.
Everyone has a card story, you see. This has been so brilliant. Thank you for the advice as well. Really appreciate it. I've got one final question for you, Lucy. So you're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. Everybody always pulls that face. I don't know why. You can be the Jam, the Style Council, Paul Weller solo. What would you go with?
I'm so unoriginal. Wildwood.
That's not ever a bad answer. It's a great song. Why that one?
I can't answer. I think it's like in the opening line. I don't know. It's haunting and it's kind of permanent.
Brilliant. That's a great answer. This has been such a delight.
Pleasure.
I knew it would be. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
My thanks once again to Lucy Hooberman for joining me on the podcast. What a lovely chat. A brand new perspective, I think, on the film JerUSAlem from the Style Council. If you want to find out more, head to my website, paulwellerfanpodcast.com. Plenty of links in the show notes there on the Red Wedge documentary, JerUSAlem, and much more. And I should say thanks again to Lucy for sharing her expertise in oral history as well. I definitely took on board a lot of that advice for the book. If you want to find out more on that, then search Paul Weller, Dancing Through the Fire, the authorized oral history, which is available for pre-order right now. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please do spread the word, share on social media. And as these things are completely free, and obviously this thing is completely free, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So if you fancy buying us a virtual coffee, that would be lovely as well. Just head to my store, paulwellerfanpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.